Some people don't raise their voice when power walks toward them, they let silence do the work. The road was dry, cracked into thin lines that stretched across the farmland like old scars, and the late afternoon light sat low over the hills, turning everything a dull gold that felt heavier than it should have been, as if the land itself hadn't quite decided whether the war was truly over. The farmhouse stood alone at the edge of a field that had once been neat and full but now grew uneven, rows broken, patches missed, work left unfinished in ways that spoke louder than any report. She was there, kneeling in the dirt, sleeves rolled past her elbows, hands steady, moving through the soil as if nothing else existed. Anna Weber did not look up when the sound of an engine carried across the open space, did not pause when the jeep came into view, did not react when the tires slowed and pressed into the earth just 30 feet away. The engine cut. Doors opened. Boots followed. Sergeant Daniel Hayes stepped down first, scanning the property the way a man does when he's learned not to trust quiet places, his gaze moving from the house to the barn to the girl in the field. She did not acknowledge him. "Ma'am," he called, voice even, not unkind, but firm in the way authority tends to be when it expects an answer. Nothing. Just the faint sound of wind brushing through what remained of the crop. Another soldier shifted behind him, impatience already forming in the set of his shoulders. Hayes took a few steps forward, closing the distance to 20 feet, then 15, boots pressing into dry soil that gave slightly under his weight. "We need to ask you a few questions," he said, slower this time, as if clarity might bridge whatever gap stood between them. Still nothing. Not even a glance. She continued working, fingers moving through the dirt with careful precision, as if each inch mattered more than the men now standing on her land. The silence began to stretch, not empty, but full of something none of them could quite name. Hayes stopped 10 feet away. Close enough now to see the lines of her face, the calm in it, the absence of fear he had come to expect in places like this. Behind him, a soldier. Shifted again, the faint sound of fabric and gear breaking the stillness. "Sir," the man muttered under his breath, not loud, but enough. Hayes didn't respond. His eyes stayed on her. Because something was off. Not wrong. Not threatening. Just, deliberate. As if she had already decided how this moment would unfold, long before they arrived. The wind moved again, slower this time, brushing loose strands of her hair across her face. She didn't push them back. She didn't look up. She didn't speak. And somehow, that silence began to feel louder than anything they could have said. The air shifted first, not in sound but in weight, the kind of quiet that presses against the chest, and Hayes felt it before he understood it, the way a man senses a storm without seeing the clouds, and behind him one of the soldiers cleared his throat, a small impatient sound that did not belong in a place like this. "She is ignoring you, sir," he said, not loud, but enough to break the line of stillness that had formed between them, and still she did not respond, not a flinch, not a pause. Her hands continuing their slow, methodical movement through the soil as if time itself moved differently around her, as if the presence of uniforms and authority did not alter the rhythm she had chosen. Hayes lifted a hand slightly, not a command, just enough to keep the others from stepping forward, because something in this moment required restraint, something he could not yet explain but knew better than to interrupt, and he took another step, closing the distance to just a few feet now. Close enough to hear the faint sound of dirt shifting under her fingers, close enough to see the small details most would miss, the steadiness of her breathing, the absence of urgency, the way her shoulders remained level, unguarded but not vulnerable, simply, grounded. "We are not here to cause trouble," he said, quieter this time, not projecting authority but offering something else, something closer to clarity, and for the first time there was the slightest change, not in her expression, but in the pace of her movement, a fraction slower, almost imperceptible, but enough for him to notice, enough to confirm that she had heard every word from the beginning, that her silence was not confusion, not fear, but a decision. Behind him, the soldiers shifted again, boots pressing into the dry ground, the faint jingle of gear filling the space that her silence refused to give them, and one of them stepped half a pace forward before stopping himself, uncertain now, because the rules they were used to did not seem to apply here, not in the way they expected, not with her. Hayes watched her carefully, the way her hands finally came to rest, fingers still touching the soil as if marking a place, and then, slowly, she stood, not rushed, not hesitant, just deliberate, rising to her full height with a calm that did not challenge but did not yield either, and for a brief second, the world seemed to narrow to that single movement, the field, the house, the men, all fading behind it. She did not look at the soldiers first, she looked at the land, just for a moment, as if confirming something unseen, then turned and began walking toward the house, each step measured, steady, leaving them standing where they were, uncertain whether to follow, to call out, or to wait, and no one moved, because somehow, without a single word spoken, she had already set the pace, and they were the ones adjusting to it. The screen door did not slam when she entered, it closed with a soft wooden click that seemed to echo longer than it should have, and for a moment no one moved, not Hayes, not the men behind him, not even the wind, as if the entire scene had been placed on hold by a decision none of them had been part of. One of the soldiers shifted his weight and glanced toward Hayes, waiting for direction, but Hayes did not give one, his eyes fixed on the doorway she had just passed through, measuring something he could not yet define, because this was not avoidance, not fear, not even defiance in the way he had seen before. This was something steadier, something chosen. "Do we follow?" the soldier asked quietly, and Hayes did not answer right away, his gaze moving briefly across the house, the windows, the stillness of the structure, the absence of any hurried movement inside, and that absence told him more than noise ever could, because if she had intended to hide, there would have been signs, a shift in curtains, a shadow moving too fast, something, but there was nothing, only the same calm that had been in the field. "We wait," Hayes said finally, his voice low, controlled, and the men settled, though not comfortably, their posture caught between readiness and hesitation, because waiting was not what they were trained for in moments like this. Seconds stretched, then a full minute, the kind of time that feels longer when there is nothing to fill it, and Hayes became aware of small details again, the faint creak of wood as the farmhouse adjusted to the late afternoon heat, the distant call of a bird somewhere beyond the broken rows of crops, the way dust settled slowly around their boots as if gravity itself had softened. Then the door opened again, just as quietly as before, and she stepped out, holding something in her hands, not concealed, not raised, simply carried, and every man saw it at the same time but none of them understood it yet. Not fully, because it was not the kind of object they had prepared for. Not something that fit into any of the expectations they had brought with them. She walked toward the table near the side of the house, the same steady pace, the same unbroken rhythm, and placed it down with care, as if the act itself mattered as much as what she had brought, and then she stepped back, just one step, leaving space between herself and the object, her hands now empty at her sides. The soldier's attention shifted from her to the table, to what rested there, and Hayes moved closer. Slowly, each step deliberate, until he stood within a few feet, close enough to see the details clearly, and in that moment something in his expression changed, subtle but unmistakable, because understanding arrived not all at once but in a quiet realization that settled into place. Behind him, one of the soldiers leaned slightly, trying to see, trying to interpret, but Hayes lifted a hand without looking back. A small motion that stopped him immediately, not forceful, just certain, and the space grew still again, heavier now, not with tension but with meaning. Hayes looked from the object to her, and for the first time, she met his gaze directly, not challenging, not asking, simply holding it, and in that exchange, something passed between them that required no translation, no explanation, and no raised voice, only recognition. It was a small wooden box, no larger than a man's hand, worn smooth at the edges as if it had been opened and closed 100 times, and inside, resting on a folded piece of cloth, lay a simple metal tag and a photograph, nothing dramatic, nothing that demanded attention at first glance, and yet everything about it carried weight, the kind that did not need explanation. Hayes did not reach for it immediately, he only looked, letting the details settle, the faint scratches on the surface of the tag, the careful way the photograph had been preserved, the absence of anything careless in how it had been placed there, and then he understood, not fully, not the whole story, but enough to know that this was not a gesture meant to defend, not a warning, not even a plea, but something else entirely, something rooted deeper than the moment they were standing in. Behind him, one of the soldiers shifted again, quieter now, as if the presence of the object had changed the rules without anyone announcing it, and Hayes finally lowered himself slightly, not kneeling, not bending in submission, but bringing himself closer to its level, his hand hovering for a brief second before he gently lifted the edge of the photograph, careful not to disturb the rest, and what he saw was simple, a man standing in front of the same house years earlier, the same fields full, the same structure intact. A life captured before everything else had taken its turn. Hayes exhaled slowly, almost without realizing it, and placed the photograph back exactly as he had found it, no shift, no disturbance, and when he straightened, his expression had changed in a way the others could not immediately read, not softer, not weaker, just clearer, as if a line had been drawn that he now refused to cross. He turned slightly toward the men behind him, lifting his hand again, palm open this time. A quiet signal that required no words, and they understood, not because they had been told, but because something in the air had shifted enough to make instruction unnecessary. One of them lowered his stance, another took a small step back, boots easing away from the tension they had carried into the field, and the distance between them and the table widened by just a few inches, but it was enough to mark the change. Hayes looked back at her then, meeting her gaze again, and there was no challenge in it, no demand for explanation, only acknowledgement, the kind that passes between two people when something important has been placed on the table without being spoken. She did not move, did not reclaim the box, did not step forward or back, she simply stood, hands at her sides, as if the act itself had already said everything that needed to be said. The wind moved again, lighter now, brushing across the field, and for the first time since they had arrived, the space felt open, not controlled, not contested, just settled, and Hayes gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, not to her, not to the men, but to the moment itself, before turning slightly, his voice low when he finally spoke. "We are done here," and no one questioned it, because they had all felt it, the shift that no order could have created, and as they stepped back, one by one, it became clear that nothing had been taken, nothing had been forced, and yet something had changed, something that would stay long after they left the road behind. The gravel shifted under their boots as they moved back toward the jeep, not in a rush, not with the sharp efficiency they had arrived with, but slower now, each step carrying a weight that had not been there before, and Hayes was the last to turn fully away, his gaze lingering for a second longer than necessary, not on the house, not on the field, but on her, still standing exactly where she had been, hands at her sides, the small wooden box resting untouched on the table between them like a boundary no one would cross again. One of the soldiers reached the vehicle first and paused by the open door, glancing back as if expecting something else to happen, some final instruction, some correction, but nothing came, because there was nothing left to correct, nothing left to take, and Hayes closed the distance in silence, stopping just short of the jeep before looking down briefly at the ground, as if marking the place in his memory without meaning to. "Sir," the same soldier said quietly, his voice different now, less certain, "we are just leaving," and Hayes did not answer. Immediately, his eyes lifting again toward the table, toward the box, toward the still figure beside it, and then back to the man in front of him. "Yes," he said simply, not as a dismissal, not as a command, but as a conclusion that had already been reached the moment the box was set down. The soldier nodded once, slower than before, and climbed into the jeep without another word, the others following, each movement quieter, more measured, as if the noise they made mattered now in a way it had not earlier. Hayes remained outside for a second longer, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the door, and then he turned his head just slightly, not enough to fully face her again, but enough to acknowledge her presence one last time, and though she had not moved, had not spoken, there was no sense of distance in that moment, only a quiet understanding that required nothing further. He stepped into the jeep, the engine turning over with a low, steady sound that felt almost out of place against the stillness of the land, and as the vehicle began to roll forward, the tires pressing into the same dry road they had arrived on, Hayes looked ahead, but his mind remained behind, replaying the image of the box, the photograph, the way it had been placed without hesitation, without explanation, and he realized that what had stopped them was not the object itself, but the clarity of what it represented, something that stood outside orders, outside suspicion, something that did not need to be defended because it could not be taken. The farmhouse grew smaller in the distance, the field stretching wide again, reclaiming its quiet, and she remained there, a still figure against the fading light, unchanged by their arrival, unchanged by their departure, as if the moment had belonged entirely to her from the beginning. The road curved slightly ahead, and the house disappeared from view. But the silence she had held did not fade with it, it stayed, settling into the space between words, into the pause before decisions, into the understanding that sometimes the strongest line is the one that is never spoken, and Hayes rested his arm lightly against the window frame, eyes forward, knowing without needing to say it that they had not stepped back because they were told to, they had stepped back because something in that quiet moment had made it the only thing left to do. The road stretched ahead in a long pale line, cutting through fields that had seen too much and said too little, and inside the jeep no one spoke for the first mile, not because there was nothing to say, but because no one was certain how to say it without breaking something that had quietly settled between them. The engine filled the space instead, a steady low hum that carried them forward, and Hayes kept his eyes on the horizon, though his mind stayed anchored behind them, returning again and again to the image of the small wooden box, the way it had been placed without hesitation, without fear, as if it had always been meant to sit there at that exact moment. One of the soldiers shifted in his seat, adjusting his grip on nothing in particular, then finally exhaled, a sound that felt louder than it should have been. "I thought she was refusing," he said, not looking at anyone, just letting the words settle into the air, and no one corrected him, but no one agreed either, because the word did not fit anymore, not after what they had seen. Hayes glanced briefly to the side, not turning his head fully, just enough to acknowledge the voice. "She was choosing," he said, his tone even, not instructional, just precise, and the distinction hung there, quiet but clear, reshaping the moment in a way that made it harder to simplify. The soldier nodded slightly, absorbing it, and looked out toward the passing fields, where patches of land rolled by in uneven stretches, some tended, some abandoned, all carrying the same quiet weight. Another man in the back leaned forward just a little, resting his forearms on his knees. "That box," he said, slower, as if testing the thought. It was not a warning, and Hayes shook his head once. "Small, certain, no," he replied, and after a second added, "It was a line, and that was enough, no further explanation needed, because they had all felt it." The moment when something invisible had become impossible to cross. The jeep rolled over a slight rise, the road dipping gently on the other side, and the farmhouse was long gone from view now, replaced by open land that looked the same at a distance but carried none of what they had just left behind. Hayes rested his hand lightly against the side of the door, fingers relaxed, not gripping, and watched the light shift across the fields as the sun lowered, stretching shadows longer across the ground, and he realized that nothing about the encounter had been loud, nothing had forced their decision, and yet it had been one of the clearest moments he had experienced since arriving. Clearer than orders, clearer than briefings, because it had not been given to him, it had been shown. Behind him, the men settled into a quieter posture, the kind that comes when something unresolved becomes understood without needing to be solved, and the space inside the jeep changed, not heavy, not tense, just thoughtful, as if each of them carried a piece of the same realization in their own way. The road continued forward, mile after mile, but the rhythm of the drive had shifted, slower somehow, even at the same speed, and Hayes let his gaze soften slightly, not searching, not scanning, just taking in what was in front of him, knowing that what mattered about that moment was not what had happened, but what had not happened, the step that was not taken, the question that was not forced, the silence that had held its ground. And as the jeep moved farther from the farm, that silence did not fade, it traveled with them, settling into the spaces between their words, reminding them in a way no command ever could that some lines are not drawn with authority, but with quiet certainty that makes stepping back the only possible choice. By the time they reached the next crossroads, the sun had dropped lower, casting long shadows across the road that stretched like quiet reminders of everything left behind, and Hayes slowed the jeep slightly, not because of the terrain, but because something in him had not quite moved on, as if part of that field still held his attention in a way that distance could not erase. The wooden sign at the intersection leaned slightly to one side, its paint faded, directions barely visible, and he brought the vehicle to a stop without announcing it, the engine idling in a low steady rhythm that filled the silence without breaking it. One of the soldiers looked up, surprised, glancing around as if expecting a checkpoint or an instruction. sir?" he asked, but Hayes did not answer immediately, his gaze fixed somewhere ahead, not on the road itself, but on the idea of continuing without understanding what had just happened, and that, more than anything, gave him pause. He rested both hands lightly on the wheel, not gripping, just holding, and after a moment he spoke, not turning to them, "What did you see back there?" The question hung in the air, simple in structure but heavier in meaning, and the men shifted slightly, not used to being asked, not in that way, not without a correct answer already expected. One of them spoke first, cautious, "A farm, a civilian, someone avoiding contact," he said, his voice steady but uncertain, and Hayes nodded once, not agreeing, not disagreeing, just acknowledging. Another leaned forward slightly, thinking harder now. "She was not afraid," he added, slower, and that seemed closer, but still not complete. Hayes let the silence stretch again, giving space for the thought to form rather than forcing it, and finally the same soldier who had spoken earlier exhaled and said, "She knew we would stop," and that was the closest yet, close enough that Hayes allowed a faint shift in his expression, not quite a smile, but something that recognized the direction they were moving in. He looked out over the road again, then finally turned his head just enough to meet their eyes one by one. "She did not stop us," he said quietly, "she made it unnecessary to continue," and that distinction settled differently, deeper, because it placed the change not in their authority, but in her presence. The men fell quiet again, but this time it was not uncertainty, it was reflection, each of them revisiting the moment with a new frame, seeing not defiance, not refusal, but control without force. And Hayes started the jeep forward again, the wheels rolling over the uneven dirt as they took the left path without discussion, the direction chosen. Almost instinctively, the land opened up again ahead of them, fields stretching wide under a sky beginning to soften into evening, and the rhythm of the drive returned, but it was not the same as before. It carried something with it now, something quieter, more deliberate, as if each mile added distance but not separation. Hayes kept his eyes forward, posture relaxed but attentive, and in the fading light he understood something that had not been clear when they arrived, that power did not always move forward, sometimes it stood still, and in doing so, changed the direction of everything around it, and as the road carried them farther into the distance, the memory of that stillness remained, not as a question, but as an answer they would not forget. The sky deepened into a muted amber as the jeep carried them farther from the crossroads, the last light stretching thin across the land like something reluctant to leave, and the road beneath them turned smoother, less broken, but none of them seemed to notice, because their attention had shifted inward, toward something that did not fade with distance. Hayes adjusted his grip on the wheel, not out of tension, but habit, his posture steady, composed, yet his thoughts moved slower now, circling back not to the object itself, but to the absence of resistance that had defined the entire moment, the way nothing had been forced, nothing demanded, and still everything had changed. One of the soldiers in the back leaned his head slightly against the side of the jeep, watching the fields pass by in long quiet stretches. "Sir," he said after a while, his voice lower than before, as if careful not to disrupt something already settled, "what if she had said nothing, and done nothing?" And the question lingered, not as a challenge, but as an attempt to understand where the line had truly been drawn. Hayes did not answer immediately, his eyes remaining on the road ahead, the faint curve of it disappearing into the dimming horizon, and then he spoke. "Then we would have kept moving," he said, simple, direct, and the soldier nodded slightly, accepting that, but not fully satisfied, because it did not explain why they had stopped this time, why something so small had carried so much. "Wait," another voice joined, quieter still. "It was not the box," he said, almost to himself, and Hayes allowed a brief pause before responding. "No," he said, "it was how she placed it," and that distinction settled deeper, because it shifted the focus from the object to the intention behind it, from what was shown to how it was shown. The jeep moved past a stretch of land where the fields looked untouched, rose clean, soil even, a contrast so subtle it might have been missed if not for the memory still fresh in their minds, and Hayes noticed it, the difference between land that had been left behind and land that was still held together, and he realized that what they had seen was not just a farm, it was a boundary, not marked by fences or signs, but by something quieter, something chosen and maintained without needing to be defended aloud. The men fell silent again, but this silence was no longer uncertain, it carried understanding now, each of them holding on to a different part of the same realization, that control does not always arrive with force, and respect does not always follow command. Sometimes it emerges in the space where neither is used. Hayes let the jeep continue forward at a steady pace, the road unfolding beneath them, and as the last light of day settled into the edges of the sky, he understood that what had stayed with him was not the image itself, but the timing of it, the exact moment she chose to act, not too early, not too late, but precisely when it would matter most, and that precision had done what no raised voice could have done. It had shifted the direction of everyone present without ever asking them to move. The horizon darkened slightly, the first hint of evening settling in, and the jeep carried them onward, but the lesson remained, quiet, steady, and undeniable, that sometimes the strongest presence is the one that does not push forward, but stands still long enough for others to recognize where they no longer belong. The road narrowed as evening settled in, the edges of the fields dissolving into shadow while the sky held on to its last trace of light, and the jeep moved through it with a steady rhythm that no longer felt like movement alone, but continuation, as if what had happened behind them was still unfolding in quieter ways. Hayes adjusted the rearview mirror slightly, not out of necessity, but habit, and for a brief moment the empty stretch of road behind them filled the glass. Nothing visible, no farmhouse, no figure, no table, and yet the absence did not erase what had been there, it only made it more defined in memory. One of the soldiers shifted again, less restless now, more thoughtful, his voice breaking the silence carefully. "Sir, have you seen that before?" And Hayes knew he was not asking about a farm, or a civilian, or even the war itself. He was asking about that moment, that kind of stillness that changes direction without force. Hayes took a breath, slow, measured, and let it out just as evenly. "Not like that," he said, and the honesty in it settled deeper than certainty would have, because it left space for what they had not yet fully understood. The man nodded, looking out toward the horizon where the land stretched into dim shapes, and another soldier leaned back slightly, arms resting against his sides. "It did not feel like we backed off," he said, searching for the words as he spoke them. "It felt like we were not supposed to be there anymore," and that landed differently, closer to the truth than anything said before, because it named the shift without trying to explain it away. Hayes allowed a small pause, just long enough for that realization to settle, and then he spoke. "That is the difference," he said quietly, "between being stopped, and knowing when to stop," and the words carried weight, not as instruction, but as something observed, something learned in a moment that had not asked for attention but demanded understanding. The jeep rolled over a slight dip in the road, the suspension adjusting with a soft movement, and the landscape opened again into a wide stretch of land where the last light of day rested low against the horizon, and Hayes watched it without focusing on any single point, letting the scene exist as it was, unforced, unchanged. Behind him, the men fell silent again, but this silence was not empty, it held meaning now, each of them replaying the moment in their own way, seeing not what had happened, but what had not been needed. No orders raised, no tension escalated, no line crossed, and that absence carried more weight than action ever could. Hayes rested his arm lightly against the door, fingers relaxed, and he understood now that what had stayed with him was not just her silence, but her timing, the precision of it, the way she had allowed the moment to reach its edge before placing something in it that made continuation impossible without ever saying so. The road carried them forward, mile after mile, and the darkness slowly gathered around them, not heavy, not pressing, just present, and in that quiet transition from day to night, Hayes recognized something that would not leave him, that power does not always announce itself, sometimes it waits, and in that waiting, it becomes undeniable. And as the jeep moved deeper into the evening, the lesson remained clear, not spoken, not written, but understood, that there are moments when stepping back is not a loss of control, but the only sign that control was never truly yours to begin with. The first lights appeared in the distance just as the road widened again, faint yellow glows scattered across the darkening horizon, small signs of life returning after miles of open land, and the jeep moved toward them without changing speed, its engine steady, its path unchanged, but something in the air had shifted, something quieter than sound yet stronger than motion. Hayes noticed it not in what he saw, but in what he no longer felt. The urgency that had guided their earlier approach now gone, replaced by a calm that did not come from certainty, but from understanding that no longer needed to be questioned. One of the soldiers leaned slightly forward, resting his elbows on his knees, watching the lights grow clearer, sir," he said after a moment, his voice thoughtful rather than uncertain. "Back there, she never once asked us to leave," and Hayes nodded once, his eyes still on the road. "No," he replied, and let the word settle before adding, "she did not have to," and that distinction carried more weight than any explanation, because it revealed something fundamental, that authority does not always come from position, sometimes it comes from presence. The soldier leaned back again, absorbing it, his gaze drifting toward the passing fields now fading into darkness, and another voice from the back spoke quietly. "It felt like we were the ones being measured," and that landed differently, sharper, closer to the truth than anything said before, because it turned the moment around completely, shifting who was observing and who was being seen. Hayes allowed a brief pause, acknowledging it without interrupting, and then said, "We were," his tone even, not defensive, not reflective, just clear, and that clarity settled across the group, not heavy, but undeniable, because it confirmed what each of them had begun to realize on their own. The jeep passed a wooden fence line, its posts uneven, some leaning, some standing straight, and Hayes watched them flicker by in the dim light, thinking about lines again, not the kind drawn on maps or marked by orders, but the kind that exist without being announced, the kind that are understood only when approached. The road curved gently, leading them toward the small cluster of buildings ahead, and the faint glow of windows became more defined, shapes forming out of shadow, and still, none of them rushed. The moment, none of them filled the silence unnecessarily, because it no longer needed to be filled. Hayes rested his hand lightly against the wheel, his posture relaxed but steady, and he understood now that what had stayed with him was not just her silence, but her certainty, the way she had stood without needing to justify, without needing to explain, and in doing so, had made explanation unnecessary for everyone else. The jeep rolled into the edge of the small town, gravel giving way to a firmer surface beneath the tires, and the sound changed slightly, sharper, more defined, but the rhythm remained the same, unbroken, and as they passed the first lit window, Hayes glanced briefly toward it, seeing movement inside, ordinary, unremarkable, and yet somehow distant from what they had just experienced. Behind him, the men remained quiet, not because they had nothing to say, but because what they had gained was not something easily spoken, it was something recognized, something that would surface later, in other moments, in other decisions. And as the jeep continued forward into the dimly lit street, Hayes kept his eyes ahead, knowing without needing to say it that what they had left behind was not just a place, but a standard, one that had not been enforced, not been declared, but had been set all the same, and in that quiet realization, the road ahead felt different, not changed, but clearer, as if the lines they followed now were ones they would choose more carefully. The jeep slowed as it moved deeper into the town, tires rolling over packed gravel that gave way to a more solid road, and the sound beneath them changed again, sharper now, more defined, echoing faintly between buildings that stood closer together than the open land they had left behind, and still, none of them spoke, because the quiet they carried had not been left at the edge of the field, it had followed them, settled into the spaces between their thoughts. Hayes guided the vehicle past a row of small storefronts, windows dimly lit, silhouettes moving inside in slow, ordinary rhythms, and he noticed how different it felt, how contained everything seemed compared to the wide, open silence they had just come from, and yet that silence remained stronger, more present than the light around them. One of the soldiers shifted in his seat, glancing out at the buildings, then back ahead. "It is strange," he said, almost to himself, "nothing happened, and still it feels like something did," and Hayes nodded slightly, not taking his eyes off the road, because that was exactly it, the absence of action that carried the weight of something complete. They passed a narrow street where a single lamp cast a circle of light onto the ground, and for a moment the jeep moved through it, then out again, returning to shadow, and Hayes felt the transition more than he saw it, the way light briefly revealed and then released, much like the moment they had experienced earlier. Another soldier leaned forward slightly, resting his hand against the back of the seat in front of him. "Sir, do you think she knew who we were?" he asked, and Hayes considered the question, not rushing the answer, because it was not about recognition of uniforms or rank, it was about something deeper, something that did not rely on identification. "She knew what we were there to do," he said finally, and that seemed more accurate, because it placed the understanding not in titles, but in intent. The soldier nodded slowly, accepting that, and looked down briefly at his hands, as if seeing them differently now. not just as tools of action, but as choices waiting to be made. The jeep came to a gradual stop near a modest building at the edge of the street, its windows dim, a single light above the door casting a soft glow, and Hayes turned off the engine. The sudden quiet settling around them in a way that felt familiar now, not empty, but full. No one moved right away, no one reached for the door, because the moment had not yet fully passed. It was still unfolding in quieter ways, in the way they sat, in the way they breathed, in the way they held what they had learned without needing to speak it. Hayes rested both hands lightly on the wheel, looking ahead at the door of the building, but not focusing on it, because his thoughts were still somewhere else, somewhere back on that field, where no words had been exchanged and yet everything had been understood. After a moment, he exhaled slowly, the sound soft but steady, and said, "There are places where orders matter." His voice calm, measured, and there are places where they do not, and he did not need to explain further, because they had all seen the difference, had all felt it without needing to define it. The men remained still for another second, then one by one began to move, quietly, deliberately, stepping out of the jeep into the dim light of the town, carrying with them not just the end of a patrol, but the beginning of something less visible, something that would shape the way they saw the next moment, the next decision, the next line. They approached, and as Hayes stepped down last, closing the door with a soft, controlled motion, he knew without needing to say it that what they had encountered was not resistance, not compliance, but something rarer, something that did not push back and did not give way, but simply stood, and in standing, made everything else adjust. The door to the building opened with a soft creak that seemed louder in the quiet of the evening, and the men stepped inside one by one, their boots carrying less weight than before, as if something unseen had been left behind on that road without any of them needing to set it down. The room was simple, wooden walls, a single overhead light casting a warm but dim glow, a table near the center, a few chairs pushed in without care, and a faint smell of coffee that had been sitting too long, the kind of place that held routine rather than reflection. And yet tonight, something in it felt different, not because the room had changed, but because they had. Hayes entered last, closing the door gently behind him, the sound settling into the space like a quiet boundary, and for a moment no one moved, no one spoke, each of them standing where they had stopped, as if unsure how to transition from what they had experienced into what came next. One of the soldiers walked slowly toward the table, resting his hand against the edge, not sitting, just grounding himself, and another removed his cap, running a hand through his hair before placing it down beside him. Small actions, ordinary actions, but carried out with a level of awareness that had not been there before. Hayes stepped forward a few feet, then stopped, his gaze moving across the room without settling on anything in particular. Because what held his attention was not here, it was still somewhere behind them, in that field, in that moment that had not needed to be explained to be understood. "We could have continued," one of the men said quietly, not as a challenge, not as a regret, but as a statement of fact, and Hayes nodded once, because that was true. Nothing had physically stopped them, no barrier, no command, no resistance in the way they had been trained to recognize it. "But we did not," another added, his voice softer, as if the conclusion mattered more than the possibility, and the room fell silent again, not uncertain, not tense, just still, allowing the meaning to settle without being forced into words. Hayes moved toward the table, resting his hand lightly against its surface, the wood cool beneath his fingers, and he looked down for a moment, not searching, just acknowledging the pause, and then he spoke, his voice low, steady. "There are moments when you can take a step, and moments when you should not," and he let the sentence remain incomplete, because the rest did not need to be said, they had already lived it. One of the soldiers leaned back slightly, crossing his arms, not defensive, just thoughtful. "She did not stop us," he said again, almost repeating what had been said earlier, but now with more clarity, more understanding, and Hayes shook his head slightly. "No," he said, "she showed us where we stopped," and that shift, small but precise, changed the meaning entirely. Because it placed the boundary not in action, but in recognition. The light above them flickered once, briefly, then steadied, and the room seemed to settle with it, as if everything had found its place without needing to be arranged. No one rushed to sit, no one moved toward the door, because the moment was still unfolding, not in what they were doing, but in how they were thinking, how they were seeing, and Hayes knew that what had happened out there would not remain out there, it would follow them, shape them, not in obvious ways, but in quiet decisions, in pauses taken where they once would have moved forward without question, and as he lifted his hand from the table, the faint imprint of the wood still lingering in his palm, he understood something with a clarity that did not require repetition, that the strongest line is not the one enforced, but the one recognized, and once seen, cannot be crossed the same way again. The room grew quieter as the minutes passed, not because the sound had faded, but because something deeper had settled beneath it, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood, and Hayes stood there for a moment longer than necessary, his hand resting lightly against the edge of the table before he let it fall back to his side, the faint memory of its surface still lingering in his palm. One by one, the men began to move again, not with urgency, not with the sharp precision they had carried earlier in the day, but with a slower, more deliberate rhythm, as if each step now passed through a moment of consideration before it was taken. One soldier pulled out a chair but did not sit, another walked toward the small window at the side of the room and looked out into the dim street, where the last traces of light had fully given way to evening, and for a moment, the reflection in the glass showed more of him than the outside world, his own posture, his own stillness, as if he were seeing himself differently than before. Hayes turned slightly, his gaze moving toward the door, not with intention to leave, but with awareness, because the boundary they had encountered earlier had not been marked by wood or distance, it had been marked by something internal, something carried now within each of them, something that would follow them into every space they entered next. It was not the silence, one of the men said quietly, his voice steady, no longer searching, it was the certainty behind it, and Hayes nodded once, because that was the part that stayed, not the absence of words, but the presence of something that made words unnecessary. Another soldier leaned back slightly against the wall, arms relaxed at his sides. She did not need us to understand her, he added, and again, no one corrected him, because the truth of it had already settled into place. Hayes took a slow breath, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm, and he stepped away from the table, moving toward the center of the room, not to command, not to direct, but simply to stand where everyone could see him, not as a figure of authority, but as someone who had witnessed the same moment from a different angle. There are lines you are told not to cross, he said, his voice calm, measured, carrying just enough weight to hold their attention without forcing it, and there are lines you recognize on your own, and he let the distinction settle, because it did not require explanation, it required memory, and they all had it now. The room remained still, the light above them steady, the quiet no longer empty, but complete, and Hayes looked at each of them briefly, not to check, not to confirm, but to acknowledge, because what they had gained was not something that could be ordered, it was something that had been given, and once given, could not be taken back. Outside, the faint sound of a distant door closing echoed softly through the street, and it reminded him of the farmhouse, of the quiet way that moment had begun and ended without ever raising its voice, and he understood then that what had happened would not be remembered for what was done, but for what was chosen not to be done. Hayes turned toward the door at last, his hand resting lightly on the handle, and paused for a brief second before opening it, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition, because stepping forward now carried a different meaning than it had before. He opened the door and stepped out into the cool evening air, the others following behind him in quiet sequence, and as they moved back into the world beyond that room, the lesson remained with them, not as a command, not as a rule, but as something quieter, something stronger, something that did not need to be spoken again to be understood, that the most powerful moment of the day had come without a single word, and yet it had changed the way they would hear every word that followed.